He died free, under a peaceful sun in Brazil, but with the weight of thousands of souls on his conscience. This is how the story of Josef Mengele ended, the Nazi doctor who turned science into an instrument of torture, and who, for decades, managed to escape justice while the entire world searched for him. Josef Mengele was born in Günzburg, Germany, in 1911. He was the eldest son of a well-to-do family, owners of an agricultural machinery factory. From a young age, he was brilliant, ambitious, and orderly. He studied anthropology and medicine in Munich and earned his doctorate with honors. That intelligence, which could have saved lives, would soon become the engine for one of the darkest atrocities in modern history. During the early years of Nazism, Mengele became fascinated by the idea of racial purity. Germany, humiliated after the First World War, was searching for a new identity, and Nazism offered it a mixture of revenge, power, and biological mysticism. Mengele found his purpose there, to use medicine to perfect the Aryan race. In 1937, he joined the SS, and soon after, began working with the Institute for Biological Heredity and Racial Purity, directed by Ottmar von Verschuer, a scientist obsessed with twins and human genetics. His fate was sealed in 1943, when he was assigned to the Auschwitz concentration camp. There, Dr. Josef Mengele became more than just a doctor. He became judge, executioner, and God within hell. From his arrival, Mengele impressed his superiors with his precision and discipline. He was always impeccably dressed in his white coat, shiny boots, and with a smile that chilled the blood. The prisoners called him the Angel of Death, because, with a simple movement of his hand, he decided who would live and who would go directly to the gas chambers. One gesture pointed to life, the other to death. Every morning on the unloading ramp at Auschwitz, trains arrived filled with men, women, and children. Mengele observed them as if they were laboratory specimens. He selected twins, pregnant women, people with deformities or unusual physical characteristics. He took them to the medical barracks, where what he called scientific research began. In reality, his experiments were acts of cruelty disguised as science. He injected substances into prisoners' eyes to try to change their color. He opened living bodies without anesthesia to study the organs. He infected children with deadly diseases to compare genetic reactions. Twins were his obsession. He measured their bones, mutilated them, infected them with viruses, and when one died, he ordered the other killed so he could compare their organs. Nurses and assistants saw him act with absolute serenity. He took notes while screams filled the room, as if suffering were part of a cold calculation. His cruelty was not born of hatred, but from a perverse idea, the belief that science could justify any horror. In testimonies gathered after the war, survivors described him as an elegant, cultured, and charming man. He spoke in a soft tone, sometimes even kindly, before ordering unimaginable tortures. This duality, the doctor and the monster, is what made him an almost demonic figure within Auschwitz. Mengele didn't just execute orders, he was creative in his cruelty. He proposed and designed new selection methods, experiments on physical endurance, studies on the effects of chemicals, and tests on pregnant women. Everything was recorded with precision in his notebooks, which would later disappear along with him. When the Third Reich began to collapse in 1945, Mengele fled the camp before the Soviets arrived. He changed his uniform for civilian clothes and blended in among the refugees. While other Nazi leaders were captured and tried at Nuremberg, he vanished like a ghost. During the first post-war years, he lived in Germany under false names. He worked as a farmhand, a carpenter, and a rural doctor. Then, aided by a network of ex-Nazis known as Odessa, he managed to escape to South America. In 1949, he arrived in Argentina, where he began his second life. In Buenos Aires, he lived comfortably under the identity of Helmut Gregor. He had influential friends, political protection, and enough money to lead a quiet life. He attended dinners, walked around the city, and even frequented circles of former regime members. Meanwhile, the families of the victims were still searching for the remains of their loved ones. If you're interested in these hidden stories of the Second World War, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. In Argentina, Mengele lived with a total sense of impunity. Although news of the Nuremberg trials and the persecution of war criminals constantly arrived, he trusted that his new name would keep him safe. However, in 1960, the kidnapping and trial of Adolf Eichmann by the Mossad changed everything. Mengele knew his time in Buenos Aires was over. He feared he would be next. He then fled to Paraguay, where he obtained protection thanks to contacts in the Stroessner regime. He spent a few years moving between rural estates, always paranoid, always watching his back. But his paranoia was justified. Mossad agents and Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal were on his trail. By the mid-60s, he escaped once more, this time to Brazil. There he adopted his final identity, Wolfgang Gerhardt. He settled in a rural area near São Paulo and lived discreetly, helped by German families who sympathized with the Nazis. In Brazil, Mengele aged in silence. He continued writing scientific notes, obsessed with justifying his Auschwitz experiments. He showed no remorse. In his diaries, found years later, he claimed that everything he had done was for science and for Germany. His lack of guilt was total. Meanwhile, in the world, his name had become synonymous with evil. The Angel of Death appeared in books, films, and documentaries. Every survivor's testimony reinforced the image of a man who had erased all moral boundaries. His face, cold and elegant, became a symbol of medical horror. For over 30 years, Mengele lived in hiding. He changed houses constantly, avoided hospitals, and never allowed himself to be photographed. In 1979, while swimming at a beach in Bertioga, Brazil, he suffered a stroke and drowned. He was 67 years old. No one knew who he really was until much later. His body was buried under his fake name. 6 years passed before a journalistic report led the authorities to exhume the remains. Forensic analysis confirmed that the man buried as Wolfgang Gerhardt was Josef Mengele, the doctor of Auschwitz. The world then learned the truth. The greatest medical murderer of the 20th century had died free, without a trial, without punishment, without having asked for forgiveness. The news generated worldwide outrage. Many survivors felt that justice had been cheated once again. For them, the fact that Mengele died in freedom was a second condemnation, proof that horror could escape human punishment. However, others saw in his anonymous death a different kind of justice, the punishment of living an entire life in hiding, pursued by his own past. The legacy of Josef Mengele remains one of the most disturbing of the 20th century. It represents the point where science, without morals or compassion, becomes a monster. His name is a reminder of what happens when knowledge is used to destroy instead of to heal. Every testimony from Auschwitz, every image of mutilated twin children, every story of suffering carries his shadow. Many later doctors and scientists reflected on his figure as a warning. The Nuremberg Code, created after the war, was a direct response to his crimes. It established ethical principles that prohibited experiments without human consent. In a way, humanity transformed his horror into a standard that now protects millions of lives. But the question that remains is inevitable. How could someone so cultured and brilliant transform into a symbol of barbarism? The answers lie in the dangerous combination of obedience, ambition, and absolute power. Mengele was not an isolated madman. He was the product of a system that allowed him to believe that the inhumane was legitimate, that pain could have scientific justification. His story reminds us that cruelty does not always have a violent face. Sometimes it disguises itself with white coats, polite smiles, and words of science. That is the reason why the name Josef Mengele still sends chills more than 80 years later. Deep down, his life was a constant flight. From Auschwitz to Brazil, Mengele spent his whole life running from something impossible, his own reflection. And although he died free, he was never at peace. His end, lonely and without glory, was an imperfect justice, but an inevitable one. He died without trials, without screams, without witnesses. But every story told by the survivors keeps his condemnation alive. In the laboratories of hell that he created, the echoes of his perverted science remain, and those echoes continue to remind the world of what happens when morality disappears behind a microscope. Do you think Josef Mengele deserved such a quiet end? I read you in the comments. This is part of our world history. If you found this information interesting, we invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss our next videos. Give us a like and comment on what other historical topic you would like us to analyze. See you soon.